Good afternoon. I think being the last panel after 2 rigorous days and such a sumptuous meal, cheer up a bit, don't sleep, please. We'll try and make the debate exciting so that you don't fall asleep. As the audience settles, it's my singular duty to welcome my fellow panelists to the stage. I'll begin with Professor Wafula Okumu, who's the Executive Director of the Borderland Institute. Let's welcome with a hands of applause, please. Then Dr. Boyana Kolibali, a scholar on conflict discourse and Harvard African Language Program Manager. Mr. Adama Dieng, former United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. And finally, Andrew Mwenda, founder and owner of The Independent. So from the title of what we were given, Borderlands in Crisis, Security, Identity, and Marginalization in Africa. All of us in this room, in one way or another, we've encountered or we've had an interaction with the borders. But many of us always look at a border as a straight line that separates states, separates countries, separates territories. A new dimension within the academia has been developed in respect of the borderland. In simple terms, the borderland is the space that occurs along the borderland, along the borderline as you go. And these spaces have very distinct features. In most of the African states, most of these spaces occur towards the periphery of the state, away from the capital centers of the state. They have very unique features in terms of how the people relate along the border. Personally, I come from a borderland community. I'm from Kenya. I come from the western part of Kenya. So many a times we are told you are from Uganda. When you go to Uganda, you're told you're from Kenya. So there are very interesting dynamics around that border. And it's interesting that this conversation we are having now is coming just after marking the anniversary of 140 years since the Berlin Conference, which demarcated the continent of Africa. So to set us up, Professor Wafula Okumu will give us an overview of the borderland situation in Africa and what are the current trends at the moment. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Wakesa, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me start by expressing my most sincere appreciation to the government of Rwanda for taking the initiative to organize this conference. This is an event that most of us who have been hobnobbing around the world to forums and dialogue on African issues in Berlin, in Munich, Dhaka, Tana, Nairobi. We always prayed for a day to come where we have a space for us Africans to assemble and talk about our own issues from the African perspective and within an African environment. So I'm so happy today that I've lived to see the day come true. I also want to extend my thanks to the organizers for recognizing me to take the challenge of inviting me to come and share my maybe controversial ideas on African borders. I'm actually also a child of the borderland, and I worked on borders for almost half of my career, since 2002 when I joined the African Union. I was a focal person for the Eritrea-Ethiopian border, and then later on I was one of the people who established the African Union border program, and also was the drafter, one of the drafters of the Niamey Convention, as well as the Sudan-South Sudan border agreement, and many other instruments that are being used today to deal with African borders. So I want to also to acknowledge the statement that was made by Dr. Wekesa, that today we also commemorate a special event that has a significant to this panel's discussion. Actually, there are two events. The first one, you mentioned the Berlin Conference of 1984-85, and the Cairo Resolution of 1964. The Berlin Conference, which is also known as the West Africa Conference or Congo Conference, laid out the rules, actually not demarcate the boundaries, it laid out the rules on how the Europeans will acquire African territories and then exploit them. But then it took 20 years for the current boundaries to be made. So the current boundaries were almost complete by the year around 1920. And then they continued even during the colonial period to continue adjusting and making those boundaries. So today, if you go to the African boundaries, each of the African boundary is unique in its character. It has its own nature. It has its own story and history. So you can get a stretch of a boundary which is even 10 kilometers, and you compare it with the next 10 kilometers, all of them will have different characteristics and different stories to tell. So this makes it very difficult or very challenging to manage these borders, these colonial boundaries. So the challenge has been far-reaching implications of managing these boundaries, have had far-reaching implications on the continent and in the world, because the nature of these boundaries have implication on migration, has implication on conflicts, integration, and many other activities that go on between African countries. So a quick scan of the African continent, Borderlands, reveals border insecurities ranging from trafficking, criminal activities such as terrorism, and also hundreds of conflicts on our borders. And instead of us addressing these challenges, we have been making too many generalizations and also unrelentingly searching for one-size-fits-all to these solutions to these challenges. So we lack information. That's one of the challenges. We lack information and data to definitively and confidently make assumptions, analysis, and conclusions, and to generate viable solutions to our African border challenges. We also have no African data on such issues as migration. I was talking to the AU migration unit on Monday and asked them to give me information on how many Africans are migrating within the African continent, and how many Africans are migrating from Africa to Europe, and how many Europeans are migrating from Europe to Africa. They said they didn't have that information. And I asked them, what the information you have on borders, on migration, what do you have them? Say they get them from Europe. Unfortunately, the information they are using is European generated, and they generated specifically to weaponize African migration. So now African migration has become an issue in Europe. In fact, it's a big political issue. So we also have no paradigm of understanding African border problems and challenges, and to guide us generate African solutions. We rely heavily on European paradigms or foreign paradigms to understand and to find solutions to our African problems. So, in fact, we are applying foreign solutions to Africa to address African border problems. And the challenges continues. Another challenge I've noted is the challenge of conceptualization and confusing terminology. So we started from, we're talking about frontiers, we're talking about boundary, border, we talk about borderland now, we're talking about borderland, and we talk about issues like border security, border management, and please give me one name, border management and border governance. So we're so confused, we don't know which these concepts are actually confusing how we deal with border challenges on the continent. So we also have confusing language, phrases and narratives that are also causing more confusion and problems. This actually, if I had an opportunity, I could ban them. I could ban the use of these concepts. I hear always when people say African boundaries are artificial, African boundaries are arbitrary. I don't know, it's not true. All boundaries in the world are arbitrary, are artificial, because boundary making is a highly human subjective exercise. So it's not unique that the arbitrariness applies to African boundaries, or artificiality applies to African boundaries. In fact, African boundaries that are naturally, they follow natural course, like rivers, they're actually some of the most problematic boundaries, and some of them, those natural features are the ones that are causing border disputes in Africa. For instance, Rwanda and Burundi problem is caused by the change of the river courses. And there are many other African countries that are defined by the river courses. The problem they're having is because the river has changed courses over the years. They can't find the course of the mouth or where the twirlwork, the middle of the river is. Then another challenge we have is the concept which I am very opposed to hearing. It's a concept called intangibility. We hear a lot, people talk about intangibility principle. This intangibility principle doesn't exist. It's a creation, and I don't know where they came from. I was talking to my brother Adama. We have to do research and find where it came from. Because apparently it's supposed to be in the Cairo resolution. The Cairo resolution that states the African borders on the day of their independence constitute a tangible reality, not intangibility. It says a tangible reality. So intangible means abstract. It means untouchable. It means inviolable. It means sacrosanct. And that's what we have now come to look at African boundaries. When actually, tangible means is something that is real. It's not abstract. So we have taken a concept which doesn't exist and now is applying it to African borders. As a result, we have disempowered ourselves from addressing African border disputes. Because when a dispute arises on the border, when the boundary is not properly marked, is not properly defined, and we want to correct that mistake, someone will say, you invoke the intangibility principle. And they say Cairo resolution doesn't allow us to do that. If we do it, we'll be violating the Cairo resolution. Finally, the other issue that I found a problem with is we have adopted a lot of foreign concepts in discussion or in application to our borders. For instance, we have this reference to ungoverned spaces. When we call our borderlands ungoverned spaces, what they are ungoverned spaces that are being exploited to undermine national security. It's ungoverned, and then it's a vacuum, so the security, there's no state presence, so now it attracts terrorists, it attracts criminal elements, and it becomes difficult to manage. So the state now feels that it has the responsibility to do something. So what we end up doing, we classify it as a security zone, or insecurity zone, and then the next thing we do, once we criminalize it, then we securitize it. And when we do that, we make it difficult for the local population to cooperate with the government, with the states, and then we create problems that makes it difficult. So we need to transform our paradigm on how we understand borderlands and how we define our borders, how we understand them. Because each boundary has a meaning, has a function, has a purpose. And the colonial boundaries, they were made by the colonial powers for a purpose, and they had a meaning, and they had a function. Now we adopted these colonial boundaries, then we did not Africanize them. Now we still maintain boundaries that were made to serve colonial purpose, and we're not using them to serve African purpose. So we need to Africanize our boundaries. So if we are going to say we maintain colonial boundaries, then let's do something. Either we make corrections where they are, or we Africanize them. But now it's only on African boundaries where you find colonialism existing. So we complain a lot about these African colonial boundaries, but we have not, 60 years, we have not been able to do anything about it. So what we're waiting, what are we waiting? We're waiting for colonialists to come back and help us do that. And actually today as we talk, the same colonial, former colonial powers are the ones who are in charge of our boundaries. They are managing our boundaries. They're determining how the boundaries are maintained. They're determining how the boundaries are reaffirmed. And they're determining how the boundaries are used. So we are now even managing European boundaries in Africa for them as they move their boundaries south. And even insisting that we should even move the border walls to Africa. I want to stop there, and I'll look forward to the question and answer so that I can share the things that I was not able to share with these preliminary remarks. Thank you very much.
A round of applause, please. That was a very rich introduction. Dr. Boyani, based on that brief background.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Okomo, for introducing the topic that I'm going to also address, especially the question of the Berlin Conference, which is somewhat the starting point. I think one recurrent subject throughout this conference has been the question of ownership, which is also what you just discussed. So this question of ownership of narrative, ownership of security, and above all, ownership of problem solving. So what we just mentioned here is how the imposition of colonial borders have led to these questions of insecurity, such as regional fascisms, through a colonial manipulation of ethnic identities, indeed for political and economic exploitation of African people. This indeed led to cross-border conflicts that impacted the stability of cross-border communities, subjected to inter-border displacement, and ultimately destabilizing all efforts of regional integration in Africa. These fabricated narratives around the negation of nationality and xenophobia, as we can see, for example, currently in DRC, with the marginalization and persecution of Tutsi communities, have prevented, as an example, the East African regional force from playing a stabilizing and peacemaking role. So we can see here how the question of ownership, a regional ownership of regional problems, becomes difficult in certain situations. This, for example, transformed one of the EAC members into a belligerent, like it is the case of Burundi that you just mentioned. And this has destabilized the organization of regional integration. The paroxysm of the problem of marginalization and integration is that 60 years later, after independence, white mercenaries are brought in to shoot at one's own people. And this is in turn coupled by the presence of a humanitarian industry, which rather than solving the problem, merely contains it, or in many cases perpetuates and even exacerbates it. And so in the case of refugees, for example, and internally displaced, like we see in Eastern Congo, even bringing the refugees and IDPs back home becomes an issue when countries like Rwanda attempts to solve it. At the same time, addressing the root causes, like the perpetual presence of the genocidal force or genocide perpetrators infused by genocide ideology in this region, becomes an issue for that same international community tasked to solve it. This, for example, leads to the point of a UN peacekeeping mission, like the one in DRC, itself becoming a part to the conflict, taking the side and facilitating those it was tasked to defeat. Now, to come back to the question of ownership, when this international community with its peacekeeping mission and its humanitarian industry comes to rescue the victim, but is unable to fulfill that mission, and now when the victim decides to take the problem in his or her hands, to take ownership of his or her security issues, so bringing his or her own solutions to the problem, the victim is presented by the same IC, the international community, as the perpetrator. So this is here because I work on how discourse on conflict, or how we discuss conflict, impacts realities on the ground, so how fabricated narratives can actually lead to consequences on the ground. So there's a complete shift of narrative that takes place in which roles and responsibilities are reversed and where the victim is then called perpetrator. And this has been the main issue in the region for more than half a century, and it shows that the only sustainable solution is to have ownership of one's security, the ownership of one's narrative. So I'll keep it to that for now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Round of applause, please. So, Mr. Adama, from the two presentations, clearly you can start issues emerging of the current borderland situations. Where do you find yourself in this current debate that the two speakers have just laid out?
Thank you very much. Allow me first and foremost to really congratulate ISCA for holding this inaugural conference. It is time, as a matter of fact, for Africa to own their security. And I'm really pleased to see that from day one, we have heard so many Africans who have shown strong commitment to certainly revisit the problems we are facing today in this continent when it comes to guaranteeing the security. But when we say security, and I think this was very well presented by His Excellency President Kagame in his opening speech yesterday, brief but very, very pertinent. And I think President has challenged all of us. And listening the various panelists from yesterday, today, I would like to start by quoting what our sister Louise Mushikabo said. She said it maybe in a very candid way. The problem is, let's stop these conflicts. And when you look into these conflicts and bringing myself to the topic we are debating, the issue of borderland in crisis, speaking about security, identity, marginalization. So the intricate relationship between security, identity, marginalization in the context of African borderland is a vital one. It's a vital one, yet often overlooked subject. And that is why I found it was very timely and it required courage to the organizers of this conference to add this subject for our reflection. Maybe we will not be able to discuss exhaustively this issue. Hence, my recommendation that between this year inaugural conference and the next year conference, we had a small group who will continue this reflection. I say so because, but before going further, let's define what we mean by borderlands. I think these are not merely geographical areas where two or more states meet. They are complex landscapes which are forged by historical legacies, cultural interaction, and socio-economic conditions. Security is a pressing concern in our region, and I'm well placed to say it, not only in my capacity as the inaugural special envoy of the African Union on the prevention of genocide and other mass atrocities, but I can refer to my many previous positions. I'm glad that Kingsley Moghalu is around, who reminded us that the issue is not only about speaking. We need to take action. Africa is one of the, I would say, even the richest continent, but still remaining, giving, as we used to say, the image of a beggar who is sitting in a mine of gold. But in Borderlands, identity is often fluid. It is shaped by various ethnic and cultural influences. But unfortunately, the instability resulting from violence and marginalization can cultivate us versus them. When communities feel threatened, their identities can become defensive, leading to ethnic polarization and conflict. And moreover, marginalized groups, whether ethnic minorities, women, or youth, they often struggle for recognition and identity affirmation. And this is not just a local concern. It poses broader implications for national cohesion and development. Borderland communities are often deprived of essential resources. They are deprived of services. They are deprived of opportunities, limited access to education, to health, care, to economic prospect. And all this, of course, pushing residents to the margin. Now, what does it mean to understand the interconnectedness of security, identity, and marginalization in Africa borderlands? I think it means recognizing that factors do not exist in isolation, and also a breach in security leads to identity crisis. It leads to identity crisis, and also it perpetuates the marginalization and the insecurity, which, of course, lead to what we have been witnessing, unfortunately, in this continent. And we need, therefore, to find a way to break this cycle. We need to seek holistic solutions. And I will come later during the debate to offer some recommendations. Some may sound maybe provocative, but I think it is time that we reflect that what we inherited from the colonial power, these artificial boundaries, time has come to sit and reflect. What can we do better? How can we strengthen the regional integration? I thank you.
Thank you very much. A round of applause, please. And finally, Mr. Andrew Mwenda, as a media owner, you've heard about narratives, ownerships. What's your take on how African borders are viewed within your purview?
I honestly thought you would begin by saying, given my advanced age of 112 years and the kind of experience I've accumulated, what do I think? Because I'm going to speak not on the basis of being a journalist, but being the old man of the clan called Africa. One, I would like to disagree with the, Mr. Ofulukumu. He said African borders are not artificial, all borders are artificial. You are partly right, but the fundamental is that elsewhere in the world, borders actually reflect military necessity. Generals fought wars, and borders were demarcated around areas of military necessity. So these borders evolved out of the military and political struggles of these countries. In Africa, our borders are not a result of our own political struggles. That is why the borders of, before colonialism, the borders of Rwanda or Burundi could be contested, but once they were settled militarily, then they held. Our borders were decided by a political and military struggle in Europe, not here on the ground. And what they reflect are political and military struggles in Europe, not circumstances on the ground. So they were imposed upon us through colonial conquest, and they reflect a different political settlement. Secondly, the state that sits on top of these borders did not evolve organically out of our political and military struggles. Its institutional and economic structure was also imposed upon us through military and ideological conquest. If you ask me, I should tell you, the biggest conquest of Europe on Africa was not the military conquest, it was the ideological conquest. Because look at the institutional and ideological setup of the state in Africa. What does the state in Africa here seek? Whose interest does it seek to serve really? If you think that these states in Africa are designed to serve the interests of Africans, whether it is the way we understand economic theory, economic policy making and implementation, the way the concepts of the state, its bureaucracy that we fight over, things of freedom and democracy and all this, these are alien concepts to us. How you can go and get a concept evolved out of a modern industrial society, try to impose it on a backward, illiterate peasant society and think it can work, it defies all imagination. So, many of the struggles over our borders and even our own internal political struggles are over concepts and issues generated from abroad and may have little or no relevance to our realities. Look at our borders themselves. Our borders, what we call territorial integrity, and the conceptual borders called sovereignty that we have are not generated, are not protected through our own internal military capacity and state capacity and economic capacity. They are protected by international law. I'll give you an example. Congo here. Why does Congo, with an absentee state in the east, control the east? It's because the international community said those are the borders. They were respected under British colonial, rather Belgian and British colonial rule and those who bordered it. And we follow them. In Europe, monarchs and the sovereigns had to fight wars abroad in order to ensure security at home. If you had an undefended border, it was that part of your land was taken away from you. So countries or states had to build strong and viable economies to support powerful militaries to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. In Africa, our territorial integrity is defended by the United Nations, by the big powers. So you can afford to have an absentee state in Congo, a collapsed state in Somalia, an incompetent state in Central African Republic, and it survives. So such a state lacks organic meaning to its people because it isn't designed to protect the population. Now, even when we talk of self-determination, which is a concept introduced after the Second World War, have Africans had a choice to decide which state they should belong to? Okay, I know Eritrea and South Sudan, but for the rest of us, our self-determination was done in London, Paris, and Lisbon, and other capitals. So the final point I could make about this issue of issues of identity, you know, identities can be shaped. If you look at the way the Zulu Empire was being shaped by Shaka, there are many communities that may have been non-Zulu, but through military conquest and political organization, they were able to be cobbled and made into one identity. If you look at whether it's the Kingdom of Buganda, the Kingdom of Ashanti, the Kingdom of Songhai, all these African empires were multi-ethnic, but they were able to shape a common identity. But look, the state in Congo, because it's an artificial state, its elites think that somehow people of Kinyarwanda culture in the East don't therefore belong to Congo. They even forget that those people were demarcated and fell inside Congo. So if you want them to go back to Rwanda, they should shift with the territory on which they occupy, in which case you'd have to expand the borders of Rwanda. So these alien concepts are what drives our politics in these countries. We are fighting over concepts that are not organically, did not evolve organically out of our political struggles, our economic realities, our military capabilities, our own thinking. They were imposed upon us, and the source of crisis of identity, of marginalization, of insecurity is a result of the artificial character of the state and its borders.
Thank you very much. A round of applause, please. Now, Professor Okumu, before you respond to Andrew's rebuttal to your point, you've mentioned about ownership, and you mentioned about the African Union. The African Union said the borderlands are bridges of regional integration. What have they been doing in the process of trying to help African states manage these borders? And what can you tell the audience of how far the process is?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Wakesa. When the OAU adopted that resolution in 1964, that resolution also, although it's short, but it's well loaded. It says that we know that these colonial boundaries are tangible reality. So they have problems, and we learn how to live with those problems. But then we also make an effort to resolve problems if they are going to affect our integration project. So then it says, if there are going to be disputes over when we are trying to address these challenges, we're going to strictly apply African strategy approach. Now, there were a series of efforts that were made in 1986, and then finally in 2002, when the AU was being formed, they adopted some declaration, conference on security, stability, and development in Africa. And they said that the way that African boundaries were at the time, they pose a challenge to peace and security, and something has to be done to demarcate these boundaries, because the lack of demarcation of these boundaries is a source of conflict in Africa. So as a form of structural prevention of conflict, they are going to do something about it. So they established, in 2007, they established an African border program whose primary objective was to completely delimit and demarcate African boundaries where that has not been done. And they gave, 2002, AU had given itself 10 years up to 2012 to do that, and also to transform African boundaries from barriers to bridges of peaceful coexistence and regional integration.
So will you say the program is owned by the African Union? So
the problem is that the AU border program was not completed. Unfortunately, even the AU border program is not in the AU new structure. It was removed. And that's something that I wondered why that happened, because the AU border program was diminished before it completed its main objective. And one of the other achievements that the AU border program did was to produce the Convention on Cross-Border Cooperation, Niamey Convention, which up to now has not been ratified by African countries. In fact, it's so shameful that there's no ratification from the Eastern African region. Most of the ratification will come from West Africa. And if this convention had been ratified and being implemented, it also helped to boost the African Continental Free Trade Area. Because, African Continental Free Trade is heavily depend on how useful our borders will be, removing the obstacles on our borders.
And finally, in terms of, again, still on ownership, is it being funded by the African states, or is it being funded by foreign donors?
That's where the tragedy comes from. Because at a certain point, the African Union outsourced the reaffirmation of African boundaries, and also the management of African boundaries to a foreign partner. So as we talk, at the moment, anything to do with the reaffirmation of African boundaries and also to govern our borderlands are being done by a foreign partner who assumed most of the responsibilities that were being done by the African border program. So as we talk, the African border program doesn't exist. It's actually the German, through GIZ, that's doing the work. And you can imagine Berlin, most of our issues are being addressed from Berlin, 160 years after.
Okay, yeah, that's it. So they came up with this concept, and now they are funding us to fix it.
They're actually the one who are running it. And even it goes beyond that. Even the African the governance strategy that the AU adopted is actually meant to manage European boundaries in Africa. It's not actually meant to manage African boundaries effectively to assist the African integration. It's actually, we are managing European boundaries in Africa so that we contain the African migration to Europe.
Thank you. Dr. Boyani, you spoke about terminologies and narratives and how they influence some of the insecurities witnessed in these borderlands. In your opinion, who is responsible to change or to shape these conversations so that they don't create divisions along identity or marginalization?
Sure, I think a short answer is it's everybody's responsibility, but primarily those who are impacted by it. I think, to kind of reiterate everything that has been said here, ethnicity has been weaponized in Africa, weaponized by Europe, weaponized by colonial powers. I think a very interesting example is to compare it with Belgium. In Belgium, we have the kind of dichotomy between the Wallons and the Flemish, but they don't call themselves ethnicities. A perfect example, of course, in Rwanda, where we have one ethnic group, if we can say so, but maybe could define ethnicity is a group that shares same language, cultural makeup, maybe same history, and space, in a way. And therefore, we've seen how ethnicity was weaponized in Rwanda. Now, I think Belgium had a huge responsibility in this because, as we know, Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda share that same colonial history. And this is where the entire narrative about what we discussed here about the notion of us versus them and how Europe, based on its own interests, based on its own definitions of oneself and others, has created this kind of weaponized system that they could use. And of course, I mean, the Berlin Conference is only going to exacerbate what has already started before that, which is this notion of colonial theorization of races, and which started dividing people when, in fact, this is more of an orchestrated system of ideological system. When there's only one human race, we end up putting a hierarchy of races in which certain people are defined as insiders and others as outsiders. The interesting thing about the continent is that Europe, who are the outsiders, came to invade, to exploit, to colonize, to commit violence, and then, in order to conceal that project, which is going to last, still continues today, they're going to do that reversal of narrative. And I'll get to your answer in a second. I'm just trying to kind of introduce this question. Belgium, for example, as we know here in the late 1950s, in order to conceal that there are the actual foreigners, exploiters, invaders, they're going to reverse that and use the divide and rule doctrine, which is exactly the one that drew all these borders. The project was to divide and rule, and we can see exactly how, when President Kagame talks about cooperation, which is one part of the answer to your question, is these countries, these borderlands, the only way to find a solution to this problem is exactly to do that, is to cooperate, to maybe redesign borders, not necessarily physically, but in the way that we perceive them, we understand them. Once again, for anybody in this region, compared to other regions, I mean, I've lived in West Africa, and I can see how much the borders here between the neighboring countries in the Great Lakes are so fluid, how we can be maybe on one side and have a feeling that we're on the other side. So it's really not a rigid separation. And therefore, I think there needs to be really, first of all, to answer your question, we need to deconstruct these concepts. We need to understand where they come from. What is the origin of why we are perceived this way? And therefore, how do we tackle these questions in order to reverse it, or maybe to take ownership of our own narratives? And I think it's a necessity. We talked about during this conference about ownership of raw materials, ownership of so the system of migration, how we manage this, development, and so on. So there is basically, it is impossible to outsource every aspect of that society and then still succeed and avoiding these conflicts and preventing crises and so on. So I think to achieve peace, to achieve I guess the Ubuntu concept of living together, understanding each other, and just what in ideal ways we can define as Pan-Africanism, it's because it benefits everybody on the continent, and in turn, it is going to benefit Europe. Because eventually Europe cannot continue, whether it's Europe, the West, or the global North, cannot continue to exploit, because over time, it's not a long-term solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Adama, you mentioned about the communities that live in these border spaces. And do you, in your opinion, do African governments have an understanding of the issues? Do they view, do the ways in which African governments view these borderland areas reflect how the communities who live in those spaces experience it, in your opinion?
Well, let me start first by reminding all of us, and I will say it in French, as my sister is around. I don't want to be blamed not speaking French, particularly at a time when some states have decided to withdraw from her organization, which is, of course, their sovereign right. But I do believe that thanks to this language, I have been able to interact just a couple of minutes ago with my brother, General Koulibaly. So it is, I think, important that people realize that Francophonie is not France. And I think that is something we have to realize. Of course, my hope would have been one day that in the whole of Africa, we all speak Fulani or Swahili. Yet Swahili has been recognized as an official language by the African Union, but we have not made enough progress. So, Mrs. Mshako, you have my full support. We will continue because thanks to your organization, you have achieved a lot and in many areas. Now, coming back to what you have been asking. As I said earlier, the African states have to realize that this issue of the borderland we are facing, borderland in crisis, is something which, of course, one may say is closely linked to what in French we call le principe de l'intangibilité des frontières. Discussed it last night, and I was still wondering if we should not look the French text and the English text. Because the truth of the matter is that at the time in 1885, the Africans were not consulted. This was decided only by those European countries. So we are not bound to us. And we all remember that there were two schools at that time, 1961. You have the Casablanca group, and you have the other group called the Monrovia group. One group wanted to achieve Pan-Africanism, to go immediately for United Africa. Another group, which was considered as the moderate group, wanted something to go gradually. Hence, things move, and we are still today, and just Chairperson Faki is around with us. I think that was in 2014. Another resolution, again, reiterated that principle. But my take today is, we are not bound really by this. And it is time for us to understand that les défis structurels auxquels ces régions sont confrontées risquent d'exacerber, à la vérité, les disparités, et d'exacerber les conflits, les retraites basées sur l'identité, et de saper davantage la légitimité de l'État. Je le dis parce que tout simplement, vous avez au Kenya les Maasai, vous avez les Maasai en Tanzanie, et se sont retrouvés divisés parce que tout simplement c'était la volonté du pouvoir colonial
this was decided by the colonial powers at that time. But what is preventing us today, what is preventing these governments to revisit this today? When these colonial powers decided to draw the map of our borders, they had specific interests. But what are our interests today as Africans? Today, Africa must unite further. Today, more than ever, we have to ensure that we have these United States of Africa. I would like to commend some young African leaders who understood that we have to rely on each other, starting with the president of Rwanda. Some people say, who does he think he is? But if you do not count on yourself, you are not going to get anywhere. What one person can do, two people can do it better. This is what I am saying, that the issue of borders, we must have the courage to reevaluate this, to engage mutual consultation, discussion. This is a very delicate issue, I recognize that, but if we talk together, we could have negotiated adjustments which could reduce the persistent tensions and promote stability and prosperity. It's possible, and I really hope that the African Governance School that Mr. Kingsley is heading is going to ensure that young Africans will be trained, and that in less than 10 years, we will see emerge a new African leadership that will accompany the initiatives that are ongoing on the continent. Thank you.
And finally, before I open to the audience, Andrew, there is one scholar said that he has counted over 100 disputes of borders in Africa. And at that time, if you look at the IC, the International Court of Justice, 13 out of 18 contentious cases come from Africa. In your opinion, is there a possibility to have a positive collaboration among African states over some of these disputes instead of trying to solve them outside within the continent? And how do you propose such a framework to be laid out?
Well, I should say I'm a political economist and not a very good expert in border resolution disputes. We should not be surprised, though, about border disputes. By the year 1995, Russia and China had 94 border disputes across their border. I think they have resolved about 87 or 88. They remain with 6 or 7 border issues, China and Russia. China and Japan have border disputes across Asia. Even China and India have border disputes. India and Pakistan have their border disputes in all these countries. That is not unique, some of them. But where borders were resolved, if we make Ukraine an exception, like in Europe, they were resolved through a decisive military defeat of Germany in the Second World War. Remember that Nazi Germany was trying to rearrange borders to ensure that all German-speaking peoples belonged to one Reich. And the Germans' belief that it should create one state for all Germans was defeated militarily, and because of that, it has not recovered from it. I personally think that the biggest challenge facing Africa, which is the artificialness of the state, is that the state is not backed by a security and military agenda. Let me, in 2 minutes, give a brief history of a continent I know very well, which is Europe. European monarchs had fought wars abroad in order to ensure security at home. Now, wars could pay for themselves through booty. You could do loot, and loot would pay the soldiers. The problem is that many of these European wars became long and costly, and unpaid soldiers could easily march back onto their capitals. So European rulers had to devise ways on how to raise funds to sustain wars over many years. And since loot was not enough, they had to grow the domestic economy in order to fund these prolonged military campaigns. The result is that European economies had to engage those citizens from whom they either needed to tax or to borrow money. They needed to negotiate with them about public policies and political institutions that could ensure increasing returns to capital. If Europe became the first to industrialize and became dynamic faster than China, is because it was highly divided and borders were contested. Now, of course, the challenge you face here in Africa is that our borders are not, they are written in stone, and the contestations do not take the form of war because our ability to act is decided by the international community, not by our own internal capacities. I don't think it will be possible for African countries to build effective state capacities in circumstances where they do not face internal or external threats. I'll give an example of my favorite country, which is called Rwanda. I think the first post-colonial state in Africa to evolve a highly efficient, effective, formidable state has been Rwanda. And you know why? Because when Rwanda faced a severe internal crisis, there was no fifth cavalry of the international community to come and save the Rwandans. They had to battle it out, and the one who secured a decisive military victory destroyed the old centers of power and the opponent's ability to organize and launch a war. Now, of course, another thing is that the defeated party tried to reorganize from outside, which meant that Rwanda has been under pressure to build effective security infrastructure to ensure its survival. So Rwanda doesn't face tactical or strategic threats. It has been facing existential threats. That explains why we are in such a beautiful conference room. We have been driving on nice streets, traffic lights, an effective state. Now, of course, I must add that the existence of bad circumstances does not automatically create a very good leadership. Rwandans, you must also remember that you are very lucky. You had a person like Paul Kagame and a political organization like RPF that was able to build those capabilities. Other states like South Sudan have faced similar problems, but there has been limited supply of effective and efficient leadership to catalyze that problem to create an effective state. But for most countries in Africa, whether it's Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Senegal, the incentive to really build a strong and formidable state is very, very low among elites. And even when we come to try to build one, we rely on concepts that are not domestically generated. They have not evolved organically out of our own political struggles, they're not nourished by our nutrient cultures and norms and values. And therefore the state remains, to use an expression of one scholar, suspended above society. It has very limited organic linkage with the society to be an effective state.
Okay, thank you. Since we are running out of time, the audience, because of the light, I can't see properly. Yes? The microphones, please.
Thank you very much. I apologize, I missed the first part of this discussion, so what I'm going to ask could have come at the beginning of the debate. I want to hear from these four very smart people what bad politics have to do with crises and conflicts linked to borders and identity. Because yes, there is structure, there is 1885 in Berlin, but there is also what we as African leaders should not do or should do to deal with problems that are affecting us, you know. And I'm asking this question especially because what I observe around the continent is that these identity-linked problems that end up being crises mostly come from the educated Africans. They come from leaders in in political positions. You know, countries across the continent, you know, we know people who have been, you know, foreign ministers and prime ministers, and the moment they run to become president, they are foreign. We've seen it in West Africa and this, you know, across the continent, you know. I think it started actually with Kaunda. So you are very good for the country and the people until you're running for office. This does not come from the people. What is the role of African leaders today? What advice should ISCA be giving to political leaders to actually, even with differences of identity, for people to live together? We don't need to look alike. We don't even need to love each other. But how do we live in the same space and promote the same things and just live a peaceful life? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a question of leadership. Next. Then we take one more, then the panel can respond.
Yeah, may I?
Who has the microphone? Oh, okay, please go ahead.
Yes. Next.
Sorry, there was a gentleman standing. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much giving me this chance to have their comments and also the questions. I'm Su Hao from China Foreign Affairs University at Beijing. So appreciate so much to invite me first time to be here in this country. I learned a lot from this panel and also in this whole conference. Regarding the themes, I would like to have the three comments with 3 key words. The first, suspension based upon humanity. As you know that China, as a big country, we share quite a lot of the neighbor with us, shares the border with us. You know, we have the 20 neighboring border, shared border with China. 14 with land border, and 6 with maritime border. So look around Chinese neighborhood, it's very much complicated. But for China, so far, we manage our relation with our neighboring very good. Because we have the principle for managing our relation with our neighbors, that is to put dispute aside and promote the joint development. So based upon this kind of principles and practices, so far, we enhance our cooperation with our neighbors. As you know that our environmental around China is much more complicated than the United States because America has only 2 land borders, right? So China, based upon this kind of the situation of territory disputes with our neighbors and enhance our cooperation by the 3rd word. My word is the centralization beyond marginalization, which means that even though we have the border with our neighbors, our boundary area is very much marginalized in Chinese, you know, nation building. But we enhance our cooperation across the border with our neighbors. So far, we have quite a lot of different kind of programs of cross-boundary, you know, circle cooperation. So by this way, we try to enhance our, you know, relation.
Kindly summarize, please.
With our neighbors, you know, very, very tough. You know, so far we have very good relation with our neighbors, you know, local around the Chinese neighborhood. So this is the second point. The third, I would say that's mutual learning. In this forum, I learned quite a lot from our African experiences. Like we have the standing joint or multiple troops to enhance their peacekeeping. So this is very good. Look around in China or in Chinese neighborhood, there's no such kind of a mechanism. So by this way, we should learn from our African friends.
Kindly, we are running out of time, please.
Yes, all right.
Yes.
Thank you. So may I have a suggestion or proposal that by this way, maybe China and our African friends should have the new mechanism for their forum on the cross-border cooperation, enhance their prevention conflict, and encourages the cross-border cooperation. Maybe next time we would have such kind of forum. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll take two more. The gentleman here, and there's a lady for purposes of gender balance. There's a lady to the far end. And please don't give a speech. Just ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Kingsley Mogalu, president of the African School of Governance. The panel's conversation that I've caught has touched on a very fundamental issue of security and stability for the continent. First of all, Andrew Mwenda's comment about the history of the wars in Europe and how they were financed reminded me of the origins of the Bank of England, the central bank of the United Kingdom, which was founded precisely to fund the war between England and France in 1694. And it was originally called the Governor and the Company of the Bank of England. But that's an aside. Let me come to Adama Dieng's point about revisiting the borders of Africa. It spoke to my mind completely because this is one of the things I've been thinking about and how the African School of Governance can engage with this question. And also how ISCA can engage with this question because it's a security question. There are two ways we can address the matter of identity and borders in Africa and the conflicts they cause. One way is what Adama is proposing, and that is that it should not be off the table. It should not be sacrosanct for the African continent and the African Union to revisit the question of the borders of Africa. It ought not to be, because the reality of the matter is that 60 years since many African countries became independent, these borders have been causing conflicts, and we have not been able to overcome this sense of identity. The other approach is a different one. We live with the borders, but we have to create worldviews in African countries that override small views. What am I saying? In America, it's a multi-ethnic state. But the idea of America, the shining city on the hill, land of the free, home of the brave, all of that becomes something that rises above the things that divide them, like race and things like that. So this is the kind of leadership we need in Africa, to create a kind of national identity that overrides ethnic identity. It is possible, but you need a competent, visionary leadership to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Finally. Please, if you can teach our men how to be brief, I'll be very happy.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. My name is Epi Munyana. I'm a lawyer and a legal scholar at the Lingo Institute in Rwanda. So I wanted to just make a very quick observation.
Observation or question?
Observation and question. So Andrew...
1 minute, please.
Yes. Andrew Mwenda made a very powerful observation that stayed with me, but also led to a deeper concern. So he mentioned that our borders were drawn in distant capitals and our sovereignty was proclaimed only in the language of international law, before our people had even been given, the chance to imagine what kind of political community they belong to. So that leads me to a deeper concern, especially for the younger generation. If we did not shape our statehood, can we really truly be surprised that so many struggle to feel at home with it? And of course, throughout this session, we've mentioned that we inherited borders, institutions, and ideologies, but did we also inherit legitimacy, or are we still searching for it? And so if the African state, of course, was born in the absence of its people's consent, how do we build a nation in the presence of their disillusionment? And more importantly, can sovereignty imposed from above ever become sovereignty felt from below? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Andrew Mwenda, we can start with you because, and in the process you can give your final observations.
Actually, they didn't ask me any question. They were making observations about what I said, and I agree with them.
Okay. Can you give your final conclusion then?
Well, I could say that I don't know where Africa can begin, because I started by saying that Africa's biggest challenge is ideological conquest. maybe all of us here should sit and ask ourselves, who are we? Where are we? Where do we want to go? In other words, how do we see ourselves, our past, our present, and the future? These are not issues that really have been decided by us. Practically every book you read, whether it's by an outsider or an African themselves, we are written as objects of study rather than as subjects of study. And I think the biggest challenge Africa faces was stated by Bob Marley, that Africans should liberate themselves from mental slavery. If one of the greatest Africans called Steve Biko, he was a South African anti-apartheid activist, he said that the greatest weapon in the hands of an oppressor is not their armies and their weapons, no. It is the mind of the oppressed. And earlier this morning, we had a discussion on media, that Africa should own their own media. I did not speak at that conference, but if I had contributed, I would have said, let me assume Africans own their own media, but the Africans who report these stories, from which ideological foundation are they telling the African story? Because oftentimes when I read African journalists, I realize that they are regurgitating concepts from elsewhere. So whether we own the media or not really doesn't make a difference. The ideological architecture, the intellectual architecture of our thought is shaped somewhere, and we look at ourselves using lenses produced by somebody else. So if we say an African government is incompetent or corrupt or brutal or abusing human rights, what is our standpoint? Because when I go to the United States, which is the champion of human rights, I find black people every day being killed by police, being jailed. I see so many injustices there. If an American army tortures people, you will see the journalists saying, this is evidence of what America is not, so it's an aberration. But you have been killing people from extermination of Native Americans, enslavement of black people for the last 300 years. How can you say that's not who you are? But if China does it or Russia, you see American journalists saying that is proof of who they are. So if America does it, it is proof of what it is not. If China and Russia do it, it is proof of who they are. The same thing. But that tells you how an American looks at their own society with very good lenses, with positive attitude. Do we as Africans look at ourselves with such a positive attitude about our aspirations, our systems of government, our aspirations? Even our own aspirations are set somewhere else. When we say we want to democratize, is democracy an indigenous concept? Okay, our masters tell us that democracy is universal. I don't think there's any system of government, I'm sorry to say this, that is universal and eternal. All systems of government are generated by particular realities. They could be economic, social, cultural, whatever it is. So the struggles we're involved in, the way we look at ourselves, is it us? So I want to appeal to academics. I saw my grandson Kasaija earlier. Please, Africans in universities, in journalism and elsewhere, you begin this conversation. Who is an African? What does an African stand for? What are our aspirations? Can we define these things ourselves without being, without undue influence from foreign concepts and ideas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Adama, as you respond to issues raised in the process, you can also give your final remarks.
What did you say? Could you repeat it?
As you respond to the issues raised from the audience, in the process you give your concluding remarks.
Well, let me simply say, by way of conclusion, due to the constraint of time, that there is one important aspect we should also look into, that is the technology. That's the point you raised with me last night, the role of technology in the effective management of borders. And I think here the European Union is a good example. It's a very good example because one can move from southern Germany to Portugal without encountering custom immigration officers. But this is different on our continent. And this has been possible. Why? Because of technology and trust among states. And I think, despite rhetorics, Africa remains one of the most complex and inaccessible continents among Africans themselves. I have been struggling with my Senegalese passport to enter Tanzania last year, where I was invited. I said, oh my God, how this is possible. So therefore, I think it is important that we follow example like Rwanda. And this example of Rwanda has been followed so far by Benin, by Guinea, but I would like to see the whole of Africa opening their doors to other Africans. The next point also I would like to make is that people, African leaders, most of the time claim sovereignty. Yes, there's not a single state around the world which is not jealous about its sovereignty. I remember in the heart of the crisis in Sudan, the Sudanese authorities saying, well, Sudan is a sovereign state. How can you speak about sovereign state when at that time 3/4 of your territory was occupied by the other party, so-called rebel party? Sovereignty, as my brother, the South Sudanese, is a Senegalese by the way, Francis Deng used to conceptualize, sovereignty is responsibility. You cannot claim sovereignty when you are not able to protect your population against genocide, against crimes against humanity, against war crime. When this situation happens, we have responsibility. And this is something which has been put clearly in the Constitution of the African Union. When there is such a situation, the African state have the obligation to intervene, to prevent the worst to happen. And this was a lesson learned from Rwanda. And you are going to visit in the coming out of this room, you are going to move to visit the memorial, to learn the lessons. Why have we failed our people? So that is why I said, time has come for us, if we are really serious, to get together and to build a true African, united Africa. And I think, although I have some differences on some points, but this is normal. You have now the alliance of the state of the Sahel. You have a vibrant African youth. I was in Nairobi when the G generation was demonstrating in the street. I applaud it because we cannot allow certain things to happen. Today, we have to make sure that the African youth who will take the lead tomorrow in this continent will learn from the good lessons like the one we are witnessing in this country. It's amazing. Wherever I travel, when you see people, oh, come on, this country is really something. In such short period, it didn't happen because foreign contribution. Of course, there was foreign contribution, but at the beginning, it happened because the Rwandese countries on their own forces. That means we have to respect ourselves. We have to respect ourselves as African, to be proud of being African. And that's where comes the issue of identity. My identity is an African identity. I'm black and I'm proud to be black. I'm African, I'm proud to be African. And one of the intervenants, I think that was Louise, did say, despite, we have to understand that our diversity is a wealth. Our diversity, we have to use that diversity. And I will conclude with something, it is in my holy book, the Quran, when it is said that Allah, He created us diverse. He created us diverse. Different nations, tribes, religion, languages. Why? He could have put us just one. He could have put the whole world being black color, speaking all Kinyarwanda, all being one religion. No, because the Almighty God loved diversity. Because diversity is only mirrored by His unicity. He is one, and our humanity is also one. And that is why we have today, as Africans, to get together and to understand that I am a Rwandese, you are a Congolese, but we are all together. And that is why Mwalimu Nyerere used to say, let's be the keepers of the security of our brothers and sisters. Murakoze.
Jërëjëf. I would like to respond to Her Excellency Louise Mushikiwabo's question about bad politics to conclude on my point. And also some of the things that my brother Andrew has said here, quoting Bob Marley, Steve Biko. I'd like to quote Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon said that decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. He doesn't promote violence. What he's saying is that it requires a real rupture, which is the idea that all the concepts we're talking about here, they've been already designed, conceived, thought about 60 years ago when African countries were seeking independence. So the big question now is, how do we actually walk the talk? And I think in terms of leadership, this is exactly what Rwanda stands for, is after the tragedy of 1994, is having a leadership that uses what happened as a form of process of learning. What are the things that we need to put in place in the society so that we can prevent something like this from happening again? So the pillars of the Rwandan society are broadly based on unity, anti-divisionism, which is very strictly espoused and abided by the notion of accountability. I think very often when we see even the lack of certain Western countries who have contributed in creating the world or shaping it as it is, whether it's through the triangular trade or colonization, have a hard time recognizing what happened there. I was actually recently in Japan, and one of the journalists was asking me, okay, so I need to discuss what happened in Japan, but Japan also has this history of being responsible for certain acts. So how can I maybe not deny that history while at the same time looking forward, so designing or envisioning what's the future for us? So I told her that one important thing is, and I used Rwanda as an example, is to recognize our history, is to recognize the mistakes we've made. Rwanda has made mistakes, and this is what led to the genocide. And we learned from there. And today, Rwanda serves as a model for the rest of the world. I come from former Yugoslavia, which used to favor unity, anti-divisionism, and then broke apart, and today we are still at that level of not taking accountability for what happened. So I think leadership is key. Leadership has to define where we're going, what our society is going to be, or how we envision it. Leadership also is going to define the connection between what we call national identities and particular identities. Every country in the world, the United States, Canada, they have so many different identities. So how do they put them together? How do we, Francophonie is a perfect example. How do we put all this diversity in the same place without denying particular identities? And this is just, I'm going to end on this. The question of what is Africa is extremely important because it's been asked for a very long time. One of the ways that it's been asked is through language. Since the 1960s, African writers have asked, what is African literature? Is it literature written by Africans? Is it literature written about Africa? Is it literature written in African languages? And again, to come back to the question of decolonizing the mind, I'm going to refer to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote this seminal book about decolonizing the mind, where he does ask this question of language. And French has been a language of colonization, a language of subjugation. Again, Senegal is an example where only 30% or so people speak French, and about 80% speak Wolof. You discussed the question of Swahili, Fulani. There's so many languages that can federate Africa. And so language has, for a long time, and it still is, the only official language of Senegal. The other ones are called national languages. So that doesn't mean that France and Francophonie as an organization didn't recognize the importance of national languages, which is why more and more or more studies are being made, especially in Senegal. Actually, there have been several studies that have shown that children that learn in their native language from 0 to 5 years old are going to be more inclined to learn more languages after that. I mean, imagine a child who comes to school that has never heard that language. When they go back to home, to their home, they cannot even communicate about what they learn in school, and having to learn every single subject in this new language. But starting from something that they master and then learning and integrating more language is what is going to allow this opening to the world. Just to finish on one little thing is partnerships and economic partnership mainly that leads to development, and this has to do with free movement of people and goods. Africa as it is today has huge potential and so much potential and a young population that is going to fill in those gaps or at least allow this development to happen. And peace and cooperation will be able to happen in the situation where economic partnerships are happening, are possible, where borders are not closed. And so one thing in terms of model, I think, is the Kigali principles, although I know that in action it's not necessarily practiced by those who are the signatories of it, but I know that Rwanda has been following its Kigali principles, whether it's in Mozambique, in CAR, and it has contributed in peacekeeping not only in its own country in securing its borders, in securing its people, but also in the rest of the continent. So partnership within Africa and partnership with Africa and outside of Africa is key to peace, development, and self-determination. Thank you.
And finally, Professor.
Thank you very much for giving me the last chance and to ice the cake. In terms of conflict prevention and resolution of border disputes, I have two suggestions to make, and then perhaps I have some general recommendations to make. First, we need to think out of the box. We need to adopt that mentality of thinking out of the box. And we should not be restrained by language or narratives that I shared with you at the beginning. For instance, we shouldn't be afraid to make boundary adjustments or even territorial swapping if that will enhance our peaceful coexistence or enhance our economic cooperation. For instance, since 1964, Europe has had 28 boundary adjustments and territorial swapping, while only 4 boundary adjustments have taken place in Africa. Then in terms of conflicts and resolution and settlement, we need to provide incentives for peaceful, dividends of peaceful borders. Tensions on our borders, conflicts, disputes, usually cost 3 to 5% of GDP per year. So when you have border disputes, that's how much it costs. So if we can sell dividends of peaceful borders or settling of outstanding border disputes, you can imagine the amount of boosting of our economy that will lead to. And this has been proven by economic studies. And then in terms of other things, we need to reconceptualize how we look at borders. We need to adopt a new paradigm on our borders, and that paradigm should enable us to fully own our borders instead of continuing to rely on outsiders on what we do with our borders. So we need to recapture the Pan-African spirit, Pan-Africanism spirit, so that it guides our border governance that promotes continental integration, because that's like the spirit or the fuel that moves that vehicle of continental integration. We also must totally own our narratives on our borders. Right now, our narratives are determined from outside. The one we have is actually confusing and undermining our efforts to make the borders peaceful and work for us. We must also restore the African Union Border Program in the AU institutional structure. We must ratify the Namibia Convention and set up a secretariat to coordinate and implement that convention, because that's one key to addressing some of the issues we have been addressing in this panel. We must restore, we used to have meetings of ministers in charge of borders, and they will come for a week and meet and discuss and share experiences, and it used to be a very rich and effective way of promoting cross-border cooperation in Africa. That meeting of ministers in charge of borders doesn't take place anymore. We also need to review the current arrangements that favor foreign determination of what happens on African borders. We need to liberate African borders from foreign domination and foreign control. And African states must fully commit to reaffirm their boundaries. So far, the exercise of reaffirming even the boundaries that we inherited from colonialism is far, far lagging behind. And what has happened is that the approaches that we are adopting to govern our borderlands are also not working for the benefit of what people living in the borderland and also for the relationship between the two countries. And finally, we must have solutions to our border problems. We do have them, but not only that, we also have the capacity and we have the capability to address all the challenges on our border problems. What we are encountering at the moment is we have some sense of feeling that unless someone comes in from outside and boosts us or does it for us, because it's the responsibility, these borders were done by the Europeans, so the Europeans are responsible for them to come and correct the messes on our borders. No, we have the capacity, we have the capability, we can do it. But if we continue relying on the foreigners, then they come in with their solutions, and their solutions don't work for us. So we must have the understanding that we have the resources and we have the capacity, and when the others come, they only complement what we have. They don't supplement what we have. And finally, we should avoid a self-imposed state of disembowelment that exposes our borders to outsiders to own them and then also control them. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I really enjoyed every second.
Yeah, thank you very much for that robust conversation. We short over time a little bit, but it shows you how passionate this topic is. And perhaps I want to the organizers, maybe you need to give us some more time next time to explore, but thank you to the panel. Andrew Mwenda, thank you so much. Mr. Adama, thank you. Dr. Boyan and Professor Okumu, that was a very robust conversation. A round of applause, please. Yeah, and in the words of His Excellency yesterday, the borderless world, there will be new threats every day from pandemics, from cybercrime, so it's not cast in stone. So to our members in the security uniform, the ball is in your court. Thank you.